afternoon. This is our 14th session of Journey Down the Clackamas. I'm Glenn Ahrens, the Oregon State University Extension Forester here in Clackamas County and also Marion and Hood River counties. Joining me tonight, Gail Shalom from the Clackamas River Basin Council. She'll be helping with the technical aspects of the Zoom session. I have some things to cover before we get started. First, about the Clackamas River Basin Council. The council is celebrating its 25th year anniversary since founding in 1996. And the CRBC has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. Their mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and to improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for all those who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas River Basin. On behalf of the Basin Council, I'd like to thank our two gold sponsors for this conference, the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas Water Environmental Services. There's a 1-minute video that describes some of what the Recycling Cooperative does. So I guess, are we going to run that video, Gail?
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that.
If you live in Oregon, you probably know that most of the beverages you buy have a 10-cent redemption value. That small deposit has big returns, helping to keep our environment clean and green. And speaking of green, we have an easy way to collect and redeem your containers. Bottle Drop Green Bags. It's the simplest, fastest way to make sure you get back every dime. Start by creating a Bottle Drop account, either online or at a kiosk located at many grocery stores and Bottle Drop locations. Once you're signed up, it's time to gear up. That starts with getting your digital Bottle Drop card online or right from the kiosk. You'll also get your bag tag stickers here. And while you're shopping, you can purchase a roll of green bags. Now you're ready. Take your bags home, fill them up with empties, tie them up tight, and be sure to stick a bag tag on each of them. When they're full, take your bags to any drop door near you. Scan your Bottle Drop card to unlock the door and to record your visit with us. Then simply drop your bags, close the door, and let Bottle Drop's advanced tracking technology take it from here. Our team uses a system of scanners, cameras, RFID, and other smart technology to track your bag and your refunds from the moment you scan your card at the door drop until your account is credited. Every single bottle and can is counted, sorted, compacted, and processed so that the materials can be used again. They'll see new life, and you'll see the credit on your account within 7 days. Then you can visit a kiosk to grab your cash, or you can use your Bottle Drop account to donate to great causes, save toward education, or get 20% more in refunds when you choose Bottle Drop Plus. No matter how you take your refunds, you can also take pride in knowing that you're making a difference for our community and the planet. Bottle Drop. Small deposit, big return.
All right, thanks for running that. We also want to thank bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, and also Metro is one of our bronze sponsors. Thanks to the many individuals too who have donated to support this conference, and I should note we continue to seek additional donations which are tax deductible. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It is originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples. It is currently recognized as the lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and also belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. And we thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. So we're gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, and to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College, and workshop attendees can receive a science certificate of completion for each session. And if you'd like a certificate of completion, you can add your contact information to the Journey Down the Clackamas networking Google Sheet that I've advertised it for. You can find a link to that in the chat. You can just go over to the G column and add your request for a certificate, and we'll forward that to the Clackamas Community College. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to share a few ground rules. Please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate. And you can also keep your cameras off if you like. That will help us save bandwidth for our presenters and greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. We will have 2 presenters this afternoon with a brief Q&A after the entire presentation. So please type your questions in the chat. As you think of things, put them in the chat so you don't lose that thought, and then we'll select questions from the chat during our Q&A session. Also, feel free to send direct chats to people you see and know who are online here. And with that, we'll start our presentation for the afternoon. And please remember to type questions in the chat, and we'll answer those at the end. The webinar should extend till about 3:30, and we'll see how the Q&A goes. We can definitely stay as long as we've got some good discussion going a little bit longer. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Jessica Halofsky. Dr. Halofsky is the director of the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and the Forest Service Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. In her role, Jessica promotes applied climate change science and adaptation in natural resources in the Northwest and across the West. And our other speaker is Dr. David Peterson. Dr. Peterson is professor of forest biology at the University of Washington and emeritus senior research biologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. He's conducted research on climate change and fire science throughout the Western United States and has published 260 scientific articles and 4 books on these topics. So I'd like to welcome Jessica and David as they present to us about the effects of climate change on forests, particularly in the Clackamas Basin. And I believe Dave is going first, so go ahead, Dave. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Glenn. Appreciate that introduction. And I'd like to thank and congratulate the Clackamas River Basin Council for putting together such a detailed and interesting series of presentations and discussions on all sorts of aspects of natural resources in the Clackamas region. This really speaks well to the Council's efforts as well as to the engagement of people who live there. So today we will focus on climate change. We'll also focus on forest ecosystems. And just to get us going, I pulled off the most recent drought map, which is from the U.S. Drought Monitor website. And you can see that things look pretty droughty. In fact, all of the state of Oregon, almost the entire state of Oregon, is either in moderate to exceptional drought. So this tells us something about what kind of summer we had. I probably didn't need to show you this map for most of you to know that this was already the case. But this is now the 2nd summer in a row where the map of Oregon has looked very much like this. So we really do start to see some effects ecologically when we have these kinds of extreme events. That's something we're going to talk about more today. We'll talk about climate change effects on forests. We'll talk about a particular climate change assessment that was recently completed for North Central Oregon. Then we'll get into the good news part, which is how we can respond to climate change, adapt to it, and also not just for forests, but also for other natural resources as well. So just to get things going a little bit, I put up this photo here of some mostly western red cedars that we see are in pretty rough shape, some dying tops and so forth. And I just want to see if any folks in the audience today have seen this sort of thing over the last few years. And you can just raise your hand or put a thumbs up or put something in the chat box and let us know what you might have observed recently. Anybody out there?
I've seen several thumbs up, Dave.
Okay, I couldn't see that. Thank you for confirming. And that's usually the case. No matter who we talk with in Western Washington and Western Oregon, they've observed this kind of a thing. And it was striking because it was so widespread and because there were a lot of trees dying. In some cases, some big trees that had great value to people. Maybe a tree that was in your yard, or maybe it was a tree in the forest. But everybody really had a good look at this since about 2015. And the reason seems to be...
Where do you turn it up a little?
The reason seems to be a prolonged drought that has occurred since about 2014. This is not only hot summers, but dry summers. In fact, that the dryness part of it probably has more to do with it than anything. Now, most trees are pretty tough. They can tolerate high temperatures. They've seen high temperatures over hundreds of thousands of years. But when you put one summer on top of another on top of another, that can sometimes put things over the edge. And I think that's why we've been seeing some low vigor and dying trees. So this leads us to the question of how trees will be growing in a warmer climate in the future. So let's start here on the west side of the Cascades, our low elevation forests. Now, although we have very wet winters in general, we have very dry summers in general as well. As a result, most of our species here on the west side are moisture limited. So we expect that in the future, some of our iconic species like Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, Sitka spruce will almost certainly decrease in growth as the temperature increases, and especially if we have drier summers. And if you want to convince yourself about this low soil moisture, go out in the woods sometime this week and dig a small hole, and you'll find just how dry that soil is under the trees. Most of that moisture is gone, and actually a lot of trees have stopped growing by this time of year. So let's move over to the east side now. Some of our east side coniferous forests, Ponderosa pine, again Douglas fir and western larch. Now, we know on the east side it's much drier in general, with much drier summers and hotter temperatures, so these trees are certainly moisture limited. Although they are pretty well adapted to low soil moisture, if we continue to crank up the temperature and the dryness, they also will decrease significantly in growth. And we have a lot of good scientific documentation to back this up. Now, if we move up to higher elevation, we have a little bit of a different story. Many of these species, particularly up near tree line, are energy limited. That means that they don't have a lot of time over the course of the summer when they can grow. Now, they can grow only when they don't have snow on the ground typically, and so that's why they may have only a few weeks during which they need to accomplish their entire year's growth. So some of our species there, like subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, and lodgepole pine, may actually have increased growth as temperature increases and snowpack decreases. So there aren't all just losers in the climate change game. There are some winners as well. So we move now to some of our wetter areas in the landscape, our riparian areas, wetlands, groundwater dependent systems. Now these are all water controlled. They're a small portion of the landscape, but they're also a very important part because they hold a disproportionately large amount of the biological diversity. And so anything that we do to change the amount of water that's retained within these systems during the summer is likely to affect both growth and regeneration of species. So places like bogs and fens are good examples of special rare systems that could change, and we expect that species composition might change. And in some cases, if they dry out enough, these areas which have rarely seen fire might see more fire in the future. Okay, now all of these things are important, but nothing is more important than extreme events in terms of how we expect climate change to act on forest ecosystems, particularly increasing wildfire and other kinds of disturbances. So insects are a very important component, and native insects as well, in all of our forest ecosystems. And what we've seen is that certain types of insects have absolutely been turned on by a warmer climate. The iconic species here is mountain pine beetle, which likes to munch on lodgepole pine and on ponderosa pine to a certain extent. Warmer temperature has increased the reproductive range of these reproductive rate of these insects, and has failed to kill them off during winters because the temperatures aren't getting cold enough. So this has allowed an expanded geographic range and has allowed them to basically take off, especially in stressed, low-vigor forest stands. And this has resulted in an enormous impact across western North America. So if we look at this map, we can see that since 1990, there has been significant beetle-caused mortality across 50 million acres. This is the most prominent ecological effect on forest ecosystems that I'm aware of in my lifetime. And so this is a big change. It was a rapid change. And so it means that beetles are definitely going to be more active in the future. Now we turn to wildfire. And we see here a graph since about 1985 of wildfire area burned in the United States. We see this up and down pattern, but generally going up. We also see in the hyphened black line federal fire suppression spending. So we're showing here not just the area burned, but we're showing a social and economic cost that's associated with this increased area burned. If we aggregate this data and look at it by decades, we see this sort of pattern. We had some, relatively lower periods there from 1970 to 1999, but during the 2000s, we've had a large area, over 60 million acres burned during that period of time cumulatively. And I think it's important to look at this cumulative number because that shows us perhaps more accurately where we're headed in terms of area burned. This seems to be on a stair-step direction upward, and it remains to be seen whether or not this will increase, but we certainly would expect that in a warmer climate, we will have the conditions that will facilitate high area burned on an annual basis. I put this figure up here because I think it's important, again, to see some of the social and economic costs. And we see an exponential increase in the number of structures that have been burned in wildland fires. So back in the 60s and 70s, it was just in the hundreds, and now we're up into the many thousands and beyond. And this is disproportionately large compared to the increase in area burned by fire because there has been such an incursion of building in the wildland-urban interface into and adjacent to wildland areas that are fire-prone. So this will continue as long as we continue to build homes and other structures in areas where fires are likely to occur. So let's talk about 2020. And we're reminded, I think before the call started actually, that this is the one-year anniversary of the blow-up of the big fires on the west side of Oregon last year. I'm sure that evokes some fairly emotional and heartfelt responses by some of you who observed that, some of you who may have had to evacuate or had friends and family who were affected by these fires. This was an anomalous event. It was the strong east winds that caused the fires to spread so rapidly and over such large areas. This is the kind of thing that has caused West Side Cascade fires historically going back thousands of years. And it was clear that that single thing had an inordinate effect on how the fires moved across the landscape. Now, that doesn't mean that this was or was not affected by climate change. However, it is consistent that in the future we would expect to have larger areas burned by climate change, but we cannot ascribe that particular event to climate change necessarily. And this just shows what the drought monitor map looked like last year at this same time. it's interesting to see that actually the drought was not as bad during those big fires of 2020 as it is right now. So the key thing, of course, with big fires, especially on the west side, is you have to have an ignition source. And we haven't had that this year, at least not yet. Now, this is a projection into the future. And I think this is maybe the take-home message about climate change and fire, at least for the moment, that when we project into the future temperature and dryness scenario, we see that there's an increase in very high fire danger days. This is a particular classification that federal land managers use to characterize fire danger. And so what this means, even on the west side of Washington and Oregon, is that we will have more days during which severe fires can potentially occur if fuel conditions are correct and if we have an ignition source. This doesn't mean they will occur, but it means that there's more time when they can occur. And so we almost certainly will have more fires. Very hard to predict, when, where, and how this will happen, but the opportunity will be there more often than it has been in the past. And then finally, we just want to say one thing about interaction of disturbances. We tend to talk about insects individually or wildfire individually, when in fact that these factors are interacting across the landscape. Now, this is just a brief animation starting in 1997 that shows the interaction of wildfire across the greater Northwest landscape, fire shown in orange, with insects and disease, and those are shown in brown. And so we'll just watch this for a couple more seconds here, and we can see that these patches get pretty big, and we also see that the patches start connecting to each other across the landscape. Now, this goes only up to 2017. We'd see more big patches on there from the last few years if we updated it. But the point here is that we're covering a lot of that map in just a 20-year period. The other point is that as these big patches connect, that will tend to reduce the intensity of fires that occur in those locations in the future decade or two. So this is now a very dynamic landscape, perhaps more than it has been in many, many centuries. So just to summarize things about vegetation disturbance, we expect that most of our trees will have lower growth, with the exception of some of the high elevation trees. We expect that there may be higher mortality from biotic disturbances of various kinds. We expect larger fires, more area burned. One thing we didn't really talk about yet, but also is important, is the increase potentially of non-native and invasive species. Whenever you disturb a landscape, that opens it up for more of those invasives. We may lose some of the subalpine forest as fire moves up to higher elevations. Those trees regenerate much more slowly than at low elevation. And then finally, we expect to probably have decreased conifer dominance across the landscape. And almost certainly with more fire, more disturbance, we'll have younger forests than what we have had for the past few centuries.
Okay, I think this is where I take over, everyone. I'm going to talk specifically about a climate change vulnerability assessment that Dave and I helped lead for the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, the Mount Hood National Forest, and the Willamette National Forest. So we called this the CMWAP for short, for the CMW Adaptation Partnership. So this was, again, covered those three National Forest System units, and the main objectives were to try to synthesize the best available information we have to assess climate change vulnerabilities, and also to develop adaptation options to respond to those vulnerabilities. They also wanted to develop other tools and information sources to help land managers incorporate climate change into their day-to-day work. So this is our general approach. We did call this a science management partnership. It was a partnership with scientists, with Forest Service research and development, and managers on the National Forest System units, along with other partners. And we conducted a vulnerability assessment over a period of about 9 months. And then we held in-person workshops to review that information and develop adaptation strategies and tactics. And then we have a peer-reviewed report that is currently in press is the main product of this effort. So this was a multi-resource assessment. We covered climate projections, water resources and infrastructure, a number of fish species of interest, vegetation and disturbance, and also wildlife, recreation, and other ecosystem services like carbon, pollination, water quality, and cultural heritage. Now, these were some of the roles in this project. So we had a science team that did the majority of synthesis. They pulled together a lot of data and information and did the majority of the writing. We had program managers at our Forest Service regional office involved in a number of the different chapters that helped provide guidance and assisted with interpretation. And then we had specialists from those National Forest System units that provided data and their local expertise, made sure we interpreted information correctly. And these were the people that took the lead on development of the adaptation strategies and tactics. So this is what our workshop looked like. Again, it was a 2-day workshop. For the first day focused on the vulnerability assessment. We had scientists and specialists presenting the assessment, and we got a lot of feedback and had some initial discussions on the assessment that day. And on the second day, we again had the managers take the lead and saying, what really are the key vulnerabilities here, and what can we do about it? What are some kind of broad scale strategies we can use to address these vulnerabilities, and what are specific on the ground tactics? So this was our timeline. So we started this in about the summer of 2018 and had our in-person workshop in the spring of 2019. And our general technical report has been submitted for publication with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. It's also available on our website in a draft form, and I'll share that link with you later in the presentation. All right, so moving right into some results, I'm going to go through a number of different areas and of the assessment so you can get an idea of some of the results for each of them. And so starting with the climate change chapter and looking at future temperature projections. So we have a number of different scenarios for potential future greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere. And so the last round of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, their assessment report had a number of different scenarios, but 2 of them are very popular. They're called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. And RCP 4.5 says that we're going to do quite a bit to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a society, and that we're going to keep temperature increases to about 2 degrees Celsius. Whereas RCP 8.5 is business as usual scenario. It says we're really not going to do a lot as a society about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see for this, for the study area, we have projections of about 4.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. So about 9 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And so those really, you can see, track pretty closely until about 2050. And that's where the difference in emissions really makes a big difference. You can see that they diverge quite a bit after that. So here's some more details about what those temperature projections look like. The largest temperature increases are expected in summer under most models, with a range of about 3.5 to 7.5 degrees Celsius. Looking at about 4 degrees Celsius increase in warming for October to May. We're expecting that overall the growing season length is going to increase, especially at higher elevations where it could increase by as much as 4 to 5 months. And with most extreme, we're looking at about 30 different global climate models and look at the range of the projections for those. One of the hottest models suggests that the growing season length at about 24 meters elevation would extend to almost 11 months. All right, moving to precipitation. You can see this looks like kind of a big mess. You can't really see the difference between the two RCPs here. And really, there's been a lot of interannual variation in precipitation historically, and we're expecting that to be the way things are in the future as well. The global climate models don't necessarily agree on what precipitation is going to do in the future. There's a lot more uncertainty associated with precipitation in the global climate model projections than there are for temperature. All the models agree we're going to see increases in temperature, but the models do not agree on the direction of precipitation for our region necessarily. So that's kind of a big uncertainty, a little bit of a wild card. What we do know, though, is that these models are not projecting big increases in summer precipitation. So we're not likely to see substantial increases in summer precipitation that can reduce drought effects. And so these show some projections for climatic water deficit. So how much stress are plants going to experience? And you can see that even if there are higher temperatures and that are more favorable for plant growth, those are likely to be offset by pretty substantial increases in climatic water deficit. So a little summary for the climate piece here. Again, we expect substantial increases in temperature with the most warming potentially in summer and the least in winter. We don't expect significant changes in precipitation for this region, but we do expect longer growing seasons, especially at higher elevations. And we expect increased water stress from higher overall evapotranspiration that's going to be stressful for our forests and plants. All right, moving on to the hydrology piece. These are some projections for future snowpack. And there are a couple of different measures that you can use to look at future snowpack. So these on the left shows snow water equivalent, and that's usually measured on April 1st. It gives you an idea of how much water will likely be available for the summer. And then on the right, we have projections for snow residence time, which is the number of days you can expect snow to persist. And in the right-hand side here of the study areas where we have our high cascades. And so you can see we expect substantial declines at those many of those higher elevations. Some cases, kind of mid elevations, we expect almost 100% decline. And then in these squares that are blank or white, those are places where we expect only transient snow, just really substantial decreases there. And the same with snow residence time. You can see at some of these higher elevations around Mount Hood, see a change in snow residence time in days of up to 83 days for a year. And this, of course, means that we're going to see shrinking glaciers as well. So we have some great data on glaciers from Portland State University, from Andrew Fountain and his group there. And this map on the left shows the area in the kind of purplish blue where the extent of the glaciers in 1907, and these smaller lighter blue patches show the glacier extent in 2016. We expect to see these glaciers continue to shrink with increases in temperature in the future. So when we have changes in temperature, we have changes in snowpack. We also have changes in our stream flows. And so when we have less winter snowpack, we get an earlier melt. It results in more runoff in the winter. The water is not being held in the snowpack in the winter. So we're seeing, and then when it all runs off earlier in the year, there's less for later in the summer. So these are changes, these are projected changes in low stream flows. And you can see the areas in the oranges and reds are where we expect substantial decreases in lower stream flows. You can see a lot of those, again, are in the eastern portion of the study area toward the higher elevations. Those are in watersheds that were historically snow dominated. So the snowpack has a big influence on the hydrology of those watersheds. But when we have more intense precipitation, which is projected with climate change, we have less precipitation falling as snow. We don't have that water being held in the snowpack. We have increases in flooding in the winters. And so these are projections for increases in bankful flows or 1.5-year floods. And so these areas in reds and oranges are where we're expecting about a 30 to 40% increase in the future peak stream flows for this area. So again, you can see those are that's mainly happening in places at higher elevations that are more influenced by snow. And what we did for this analysis is to say, well, where are these increases in flooding really going to affect the infrastructure on these national forest system units? And so we looked at where the increases in flooding intersected where there are roads that are near streams. So we looked at roads within 300 feet of a stream. And the on the left, the areas in red are the roads that are right next to streams where we expect there to be substantial increases in flooding. So those are our most vulnerable roads that people might want to reconsider in the future in terms of what's going to be needed for maintenance or whether they should, the road should remain in those locations. Another interesting thing about the changes in snow residence time is that we're not going to have snow cover over our forest roads for as long as it's been historically. And so the areas on the right show where we have national forest system roads and we have loss of snowpack. So the road closures may be reduced or even not exist in the future. People might be able to access these areas more than they have in the past. Of course, there are some issues with that in terms of danger to the public being out on those roads in the winter when we have our extreme flood, more extreme rainfall events, potential for landslides and that sort of thing. All right, shifting to fish. We know that one of the main effects of climate change on fish is going to be increased stream temperature. Stream temperatures increase with air temperature, not at a lower rate than air temperatures, but they still will be increasing. We know these are going to be stressful to our cold water adapted fish species like salmon and bull trout. And so these are these are projections for future stream temperature. We have the historical conditions on the left and end of century conditions, projections for the future on the right. And these are for summer stream temperature in August. And you can see a lot of locations where those temperatures do increase and are likely to become stressful for our cold water adapted fish species in the future. And we can look at these projections and for particular fish species and say where has the habitat been historically, what has the stream temperature looked like there, like on the left-hand side. And then we can look at projections for stream temperature in the future and say where is habitat still going to be high quality for these fish, where is it going to be kind of moderate, and where will it not be, where will their habitat be reduced. And so for bull trout here, we can see a lot of areas along the Columbia will be too warm for bull trout. And there are some other locations in the study region as well that are kind of in the orange range, which are getting up into stressful range. So this can help really identify where restoration could occur. We really want to focus on the places that will still be high quality habitat for the species in the future. Okay, shifting a little bit to fire and vegetation. I know Dave has already covered a lot of information. I did want to provide a few highlights from the Vegetation and Disturbance chapter of the assessment here, though. And here we've got the figure on the right shows the historical disturbance regimes. Most of this study area, except for that small blue strip on the eastern portion of the study area, has historically experienced infrequent high severity or moderately frequent mixed severity fire. And we know that that fire has already been increasing. We have areas, and this is actually near Mount Adams here, where we've had 3 fires since 2008. So we have that area there in red is an area that has burned 3 times since 2008. So we're likely to see more interactions between these fire events and insect and disease outbreaks as well. And we also, as Dave mentioned, are likely to see changes in drought. And so this is a cumulative drought severity index for this assessment area from 1960 to 1986 on the left, and then from a more recent 1987 to 2013 period. And you can see that drought has become more severe between those 2 time periods. And we expect that to continue into the future, that we'll have more severe, longer lasting droughts and likely more frequent droughts as well. And again, we expect increases in wildfire activity in the future. And you don't have to look at all of the details here of this table, but every single one of these rows is a different study looking at future projections for fire that include the assessment area. And every single one of them projects increased fire in the future. So we know that is almost inevitable. There are different types of models, there are statistical models or more process-based models, but they all agree that we're likely to see more fire, larger fire areas, and potentially in some places more severe fires. There was a study by Andy McAvoy and others that was specific to the Clackamas watershed, and so I did want to share those details here. They used a model called FSIM, which is you did future fire simulations under a number of different global climate model scenarios. So each one of these figures is showing a different scenario for a different climate model, which those are the abbreviations at the top. What's on the y-axis for all of these, we have months on the x-axis. On the y-axis is an energy release component. So it's an index that looks at wildfire danger. And you can see the baseline conditions are in the black line, and the red line are projections for the future. And you can see that most scenarios show that fire danger will increase significantly for the Clackamas Basin in the future. These are from that same study and looking at the average annual burn probability. The baseline for 2000 to 2020 is there on the left. And then again, we've got the different 4 future scenarios in the future in the box. We have the hotter and drier scenario in the upper left-hand corner, and then kind of the cooler and more humid scenario in the bottom right-hand corner. But you can see under all scenarios, there are substantial increases, particularly in the headwaters in annual probability of burn. So we can also use other type of models to look at changes, how these climatic changes are going to affect vegetation in the future. And so we used for this assessment a model called the MC2 Dynamic Global Vegetation Model. So this is a process-based model that looks at changes in vegetation distribution, biochemistry, and also fire to simulate kind of pretty broad vegetation types into the future. And so I'll show you a few of the outputs for this area from the MC2 model. One thing we can look at, again, this model, like the other one I just showed for FSIM, it can run under a number of future climate scenarios. So one thing we can do is look at where there's agreement among those different scenarios in terms of what's going to happen in the future. So for here, all of the red and orange shows where there's high agreement under a lot of different scenarios where there's going to be a vegetation type change. So a shift from forest to woodland to shrubland, or to grassland. And so the red that's popping out here in the eastern portion and up in the Mount Hood region, that's where we're seeing a loss of subalpine conditions that are climatically suitable for subalpine vegetation. So basically, we're going to see probably shifts in the species composition at those highest elevations where there's going to be longer growing season, like Dave talked about, potentially increases in tree growth. We might see some of the lower elevation species being able to move up into those higher elevations. There's also quite a bit of orange you can see in the Columbia River Gorge and lower elevations where we're likely to see shifts from potentially forest to more woodland or even shrubland in some cases, the model is showing. So here this is for one global climate model scenario. So we have the historical on the left, mid-century in the middle, and end of century on the right. And you can see this is very coarse. They're very coarse vegetation types. Most of the study area is moist coniferous forest. And you can see the subalpine there at the higher elevations. But as you go to the right, you can see almost the loss of that area of subalpine forest, and kind of teal green disappears. We get, at the expense of that warm moist forest, we get more of this, what's called a warm mixed forest. So the mixed indicates that there's likely to be greater abundance of hardwoods over coniferous species in the future. You can see that a lot of the lower elevations are likely to become more potentially hardwood dominated and mixed conifer and hardwood. We can zoom in here on the Mount Hood too, so you can get a better idea of what's happening in the Clackamas. And again, you see the loss of that subalpine area around Mount Hood, and at the higher elevations, we see an increase in that blue color, the warm mixed forest, again, a lot of lower elevations, all the way down to a subtropical mixed forest, which is basically saying there's almost a complete loss of winter frost there, which is where that subtropical type comes in. And again, we expect more hardwood dominance in those areas in the future. All right, so I did want to give you just a little bit of a taste of what the wildlife chapter did look at. So the wildlife chapter focused on a number of different focal habitats and looked at the potential vegetation changes and the changes in habitat within each of those, and then talked about kind of qualitatively what that would mean for the species that are currently there. And so this is an example. Subalpine was one of those. And we know that the key habitat features of subalpine habitat are deep snow, the intermix of woodlands and meadows, and also rock and talus habitats. We know there are currently some stressors to wildlife in those habitats that include recreation and land use changes, timber harvest. But we can look at what's going to happen in the future with climate change in those habitats. We know that the loss of snow is going to be a key stressor. There could be increases of drought stress, and could be potentially loss of meadows with tree encroachment in the future. I know that there could be stress to some species with high temperatures, and that these species really have a limited ability to respond to changes in climate A lot of them have really limited distribution, and these habitats are naturally fragmented. There's not a lot of connectivity between them. But there are also recreation hotspots, which could be stressful to the species there. And there really aren't a lot of opportunities for these species that are in subalpine habitats to move upward, because there's not a lot of habitat at higher elevations. They kind of run out of room. But there could be the potential for refugia, which are places where the temperature and conditions might persist despite increases in temperature. So there might still be places where they're likely to be places where these species can still find habitat in the future, even with climate change. All right, and then shifting to recreation, there was an assessment done for a number of different types of recreation on all 3 Forest Service units. We know recreation is key for all of these national forests. This is an example for warm weather recreation, which includes hiking, biking, equestrian, camping, and driving for pleasure. It's about 65% of all recreation for the 3 national forests, but for Columbia River Gorge, it's closer to 90%. We know that warm weather recreation is going to be affected by increased temperatures and also extended shoulder season. So that's the spring and the fall. With the longer growing season, there is going to be extended season for warm weather recreation in the future too, which could be a positive thing. There could be overall more warm weather activities in the future. But there are some questions about whether people will really want to do overnights in those shoulder seasons when kids are in school. And then another big wild card, of course, is wildfire and smoke, which can decrease the recreation experience and keep people away. So overall, we expect that there'll be a moderate increase in warm weather recreation in the future in this area. And I did want to just point out that from the Eagle Creek fire in 2017, that many of the recreation sites were closed, and some even several years later. And I'm sure we're going to see the same thing for the 2020 fires, that many of the recreation sites in these areas could be severely affected by wildfire events and remain closed for long periods of time. But moving to snow-based recreation, which includes skiing, snowshoeing, snowmobiling, it's about 50% of the recreation on Mount Hood, only about 9% on the Willamette National Forest. But it's pretty clear cut that increased temperatures are going to have severe negative effects on snow-based recreation. We'll have a shorter snow season and likely some closures of low elevation ski areas in the future. So we expect that to be a high effect of climate change on snow-based recreation. And we can look at, again, those projections for snow in the future and look at where how they overlay with current recreation sites. And so these little blue snowflakes are where there are recreation sites in the assessment area. And the places that you're expecting a severe loss of snowpack and snow residence time, those places are probably not going to be great for winter recreation in the future. And this is showing, for example, we had the year with no snow, the winter of 2014, 2015, you can see a big dip in visits that year for most areas. The exception was Mount Bachelor, which is high enough in elevation that it can maintain the snowpack even when we have low snow years across the area. Okay, so that is the quick overview. But again, we do publish all these assessments that we do. In addition to this assessment area, we've done we've done climate change vulnerability assessments for all the national forests in Oregon and Washington. And so you can get those online. They're all at adaptationpartners.org. And so we have project websites for each of them, including this Columbia River Gorge, Mount Hood, and Willamette project. And if you go to this website, you can find the assessment with all of the detail for all of these chapters. And we do hope that it will be published in its final form by this spring. And I'll turn it back over to Dave again.
So that was a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. And I know that a lot of that can seem rather gloomy, rather negative. And I know that many of you have heard other presentations on climate change effects and have read probably many, many articles in books and media about it. And it's never particularly uplifting. Now, two things I want to say about that. Number one is, a lot of times people will say, well, there's a lot of uncertainty about the science. You know, we really don't know what's going to happen in the future. Or we need more research. We just need more scientific information on this topic before we can move ahead. And I would really push back against that, because we have now over 30 years of climate change science, including information on the potential effects of climate change. Things are already changing to a certain extent. And so I believe we need much more of a focus on applications and things we can do in response to climate change, ways that we can prepare for climate change. We don't need another 20, 30 years of research. We just need to get on with adapting. And that's what this last section of our presentation is about, because there are some great responses that we have out there that we can do in terms of resource management, both strategically and tactically, to prepare for a warmer climate and to make our forest ecosystems more resilient. So that's what this last section will be about. All right. Well, regeneration of forests is really where the action is. This is where the big competition happens to see who survives and who doesn't survive going into the future. Basically the winners and losers. Now, tree seedlings have a pretty tough life. There's a lot of variation right there at the soil surface. It gets very hot during the day, gets cold at night. Trees have limited root structure, so they reach only so far down into the soil for soil moisture. Once that's dried out, that's all they have. So this is really a critical point in terms of determining what we will see in the future and how trees will survive. What I'm going to do now is go through a number of topics that I call good practices, things we can do to try to increase resilience in forests. And with respect to tree seedlings, we just need to take good care of them. Now, we always try to do that, but we may need to do a little bit more in the future in order to retain sufficient soil moisture so that they can make it through those first 1, 2, 3 years. One thing we can do, for example, is to mulch our seedlings. Now, that's not something we do at really large scales very often. So if you can't really afford to carry, tons of mulch out onto a site, you can always kick up a little organic matter around the base of that seedling. A little bit really goes a long way in terms of ensuring survival. And also just to deal with the stresses we already have out there, like herbivory from deer, other things like that. We just need to do a great job of planting and raising seedlings. Now, one thing that we're really focused on these days is to ensure that we have drought-tolerant species out there in the landscape, if at all possible. And we have some great choices in the Northwest. Douglas fir on the west side, Ponderosa pine on the east side, grand fir perhaps on both sides of the Cascades. These are all species that are relatively tolerant of soil moisture. But even at the seedling stage, almost all species will be somewhat sensitive. Another thing we want to do is to diversify our forest landscapes in different ways. One way we can do that is by having more species. So instead of planting, say, just Douglas fir, you might intersperse other tree species in that landscape, and also to have greater structural diversity. So not one large, even-aged landscape for one species, but you could have gaps in the canopy, you could have different mixtures of species, you could have multi-layered canopies, and this closed and open pattern really confers a lot of resilience. The key here is that you aren't putting all your eggs in one basket. So if you have a disease, you have an insect or something that's going to cause an effect, it will hopefully not affect the entire area, but just a portion of it. Another topic that has become very of great interest in recent years is called assisted migration. This is sometimes called managed relocation, and it refers to moving trees around to places they may not have been before. So there are three ways that I look at this. Number one is focusing on the current species, but from adjacent seed zones, so further to the south, lower elevation, or drier locations. The second one is different species, but extended beyond their current distribution, but only a little bit. The third form is different species, but extended a long distance beyond their current distribution. And so this is a new topic. This is a growing field of forest science. We're continuing to learn about this, and we don't have great science on this particular topic, but we do have some recommendations. And the next slide. Okay, there we go. So these are the recommendations I'm going to suggest to you. It would be very helpful, I think, to expand from adjacent seed zones. That means we're increasing the genetic diversity beyond just the local seed zone. There's relatively low risk in terms of doing something like that. A lot of landowners are already doing this sort of thing. In terms of extending species slightly beyond their current distribution, that might be a maybe. This is something we want to be a little bit cautious about in terms of what are the risks of doing that. Are there other insects or diseases, perhaps, that those species are not adapted to or they haven't seen before in their lifetime? At the current time, we're not really recommending long translocations of species far beyond their current distribution because of those risks I just mentioned. We all know of cases in the past where we do these sorts of things and sometimes you get unanticipated outcomes. We really need some better scientific information on this particular topic before we start moving, say, sequoias or redwoods up from California into northwest Oregon. And this is just an example of a seed zone map for Douglas fir in Oregon. The concept of seed zones are that the nursery stock that is propagated is from seeds that are from each of those little areas noted in the green mosaic there on the map. So if you live in northwest Oregon and you want to plant some Douglas fir, you might try to get some nursery stock from farther south in Oregon under the assumption that they would be better adapted to a warmer climate. Again, this is a topic that is evolving quickly, and if you have questions about it, if you're going to do tree planting, certainly consult with someone before you do it. Now, the first and foremost thing in all forest management is just to keep your forests healthy. When forests are healthy, they can tend to resist insects and diseases better than if they aren't healthy. So keeping appropriate stand densities, that is, not too thick out there in the woods, will allow for enough water to be available for all those trees. So we don't want too many straws in the glass of water out there. This is common forest practice, but it's even more important now if we're going to run into drier summers and drier soils. Another kind of thing we can do if we choose to is remove some of those surface and understory fuels to reduce fire intensity. This is not commonly done on the west side, but it probably should be done near our homes and structures. And to do this kind of management of forest density across as large a spatial area as you possibly can, if one landowner does it on his or her 20 acres, but all the adjacent landowners don't do it, it really isn't very effective. So we need to work with neighbors across the landscape and do this at big scales. Now, here's a kind of a special case. On the west side, we tend to have infrequent fires. But when we do have them, they tend to be like the fires that occurred on the west side of Oregon in the summer of 2020. So these big events are rare, but they are part of the forest ecosystem. And there aren't a lot of adaptation options for this particular situation. Fuel management may not even be particularly effective, except on a very local scale. Fire suppression will continue to be important, and it's especially important to have plans in place for what to do if and when that fire or some other disturbance happens. You know, we tend to refer to these big disturbances as catastrophes, but if we have some options after the fire, then we can hit the ground running. So here are some potential post-fire management options here. Natural regeneration is always a possibility. You can promote species diversity like we just mentioned, promote structural diversity, and coordinate with adjacent landowners, as I just mentioned. This is really critical, whether it's private land or public land. And then we can always learn from these situations. Right now, this year, 2021, in Western Oregon, following the big fires last year, there is a lot of learning going on in terms of how do you regenerate forests and how do you plan for the future after such a large event. So I hope that we will get lots of data on those different activities going on, so in the future we can handle this perhaps a little more effectively.
Okay, so thanks, Dave. I'm going to cover a few of the other resources besides forests and give you some of the adaptation strategies and tactics that were developed in those science management workshops we had for the CMW Adaptation Partnership. So starting with water, a key vulnerability that was identified for water is that we're going to have these higher peak flows in fall and winter, most likely, and that these are going to be damaging to infrastructure. So a general adaptation strategy is try to design more resilient infrastructure that can then accommodate these higher peak flows. And so specifically that might look like installing larger culverts, maybe removing those roads in the floodplains that are likely to get flooded again and again. We might want to rethink where some of the locations of campgrounds are. You know, people like to camp along water, but if those are subject to repeat flooding, then we might have to move some of them. For fisheries, we know that the higher stream temperatures are the key vulnerability. They're going to degrade habitat for our cold water adapted fish species. And so a general adaptation strategy is really trying to maintain and then restore that cold water habitat for those species. To do that, you need to make sure you have the function of our streams is what it should be. We might have to try to reconnect some floodplains and especially restoring riparian vegetation along the streams, because that vegetation is shading the streams and will help to keep the temperatures down. For wildlife, we know that the increase in disturbance could lead to the loss of habitat for some species. And so we really want to try to increase the resilience of that habitat, specifically the later successional habitat that a lot of these species depend on. And so specifically, we can try to protect and maintain and even recruit what we call legacy structures. And these are things like big, large old trees, some snags, some dead trees, and also down wood. So those are all key habitat features for a lot of species that we want to make sure those are available on the landscape as habitat. For summer recreation, people, when it's hot, like to get out on the water. So there's likely to be an increased demand for water-based recreation. But at the same time, there might be a decrease in the suitable sites for that if we have less water in the summer with higher evapotranspiration. So a main adaptation strategy is really try to increase the flexibility in management of water-based recreation at the site level and excuse me, and designing facilities. So some specific tactics, in some cases, we might need to increase the length of boat ramps. If the water levels are low enough, the ramps might not get out to the water, so we might have to make them a little bit longer. We might have to manage capacity in some places, and also manage public expectations. People are going to have to know that in some cases, some of these recreation opportunities might not be available at all times of year, especially if we're in an extreme drought situation with very low water levels. And I did want to point out that Dave and I have done many adaptation workshops around the Western US, and we've compiled all of the strategies and tactics that have been developed in these workshops into what we call the adaptation library. So that's at this URL here. You're welcome to take a look, and you can do a search for different types of adaptation options for forests and wildlife, all the different topics we've covered today, these different resource areas, and get an idea of what others have come up with, and maybe use some of them in your own situation. And there are over 900 adaptation options in the library now. All right, and I'll turn it over to Dave to wrap us up for the day.
So just a quick summary here, and I like to think about this as the good news, and I really like to focus on this portion because I am hopeful that if we act quickly and assertively, we can really make a difference in terms of reducing some of the negative outcomes that could occur in forest ecosystems, and also maybe influence the trajectory of what happens in these systems. So in terms of how we think about this, we need to think about managing for around mid-century and beyond, when temperatures will be much higher, extremes will be much greater. We can't continue to use models and frameworks based on past because those will no longer apply. Diversification is really going to be critical because that gives us more options for the future. Diversification of plant species, genetic characteristics, and spatial patterns across a very large landscape. We can use future fires and other disturbances as an opportunity for changing some of the trajectories that are occurring out there, and also for doing some experimentation. That is always what resource management has been about. Try different things, see what works, learn from it. Also, we need to, I think in a formal way, implement risk assessment and risk management. Wherever you live, whatever you do, whatever you value, we all assess risks, and then we act on the knowledge that we have about those potential risks. So I think if we do that up front in a formal way, then the future becomes a little less scary, and we also become much better prepared for anticipating those sorts of things that could happen in the future. And then we just have to track our efforts. How do these different sorts of things that we're going to be implementing work? Learn from that, learn from our errors, and then adjust as needed in the future. So this is a continual learning and adaptation process, and I think if we really devote ourselves to that, we can be actually quite successful in retaining forest ecosystems and functional forest ecosystems into the future.
All right.
All right. I have to say, wow, that's a lot to think about. And I think we've got some questions to continue delving into this. Thank you so much, Jessica and David, and we'll enter our Q&A session now. I can start by going back to some that came up early on. And if you think of other questions, please everyone start adding them to the chat. In that early part about acres burned per year, question about the correlation between acres burned per year and federal expenditures. Are those expenditures based simply on fire suppression costs, or does it incorporate other costs that go up during fire season, fire years?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Those particular data that were shown on that graph relate only to fire suppression costs, so those actions that were actually expended to put the fires out. That is only a portion of the total fire management cost. And the whole thing has just kind of exploded in the last 20 years. U.S. Forest Service, for example, has gone from something like, well, less than 20% of the total agency costs expended on fire management to now, I think it's up to 56%. So that takes up, over half of the Forest Service budget, which means that all the other good things that the agency does in terms of forest management, recreation, and so forth, gets, second fiddle compared to fire. So fire becomes a very big tail that wags the dog. And it seems like that will continue unless something intervenes socially or politically to disrupt that. The other thing in terms of fire suppression increases, if you were to look at area burned versus fire suppression, there wouldn't be a perfect correlation. And that's because the topic that I talked about previously in terms of wildland-urban interface expanding has been the wild card. This has increased cost dramatically because it's much more expensive to fight wildfires near urban areas, near communities, than it is to fight them in a purely wildland situation where you just have trees and vegetation. In addition, our wildland firefighters for the federal and state agencies aren't typically trained to fight structural fires. So that's an additional sort of disconnect that we have going on out there, all of which is to say the cost has increased disproportionately due to this expanded wildland-urban interface. We're putting more firefighters on the fire, more equipment, more effort to try to ensure that structures don't burn. That's been a game changer.
Okay, and related to that, looking at the graph over time, what explains that, the decrease in the acres burned in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was that kind of lull. There was more fire earlier last century, and then of course now it's gone up. Yeah, that's one of the questions is, how do you explain that?
That was a period of time during which we had relatively cooler, wetter climate conditions in general across the western United States. So that certainly had an influence on the area burned during that period of time. It was also prior to the time that the wildland-urban interface really accelerated in terms of the number of structures in and near fire-prone areas.
And so is there any relationship with the actual fire suppression dollars spent? I'm not sure what meaning that question is exactly, but any relationship there between fire suppression spending and acres burned, I guess?
There certainly is a correlation, but it's certainly not a straight line correlation at all.
Yeah, you covered that a bit, I think. Somebody related to the, another part about, pampering the seedlings, I think. What about adding biochar into the mulch or the, the role of biochar in helping, ameliorate soil conditions and help retain water?
Biochar would be great. Any form of organic matter that you can get out there, especially if there's been, a lot of disturbance in that soil and there isn't a lot of organic matter remaining, that would be great. The thing with biochar is that we don't have a very big supply of it. It's very local, typically gets expensive to ship it around. So it'll be interesting to see if the use of biochar for soil amendments increases in the future. But right now it's at a pretty low level as I understand it.
Okay. And then another question Gail is asking regarding the practice of removing surface and understory fuel. You know, isn't there a trade-off there that, considering the benefits of that debris as it decomposes, and some of that, you know, especially the wood in the soil helps add organic matter and conserve soil moisture. So how do you decide how much understory fuels reduction to do, and the approach in order to, you know, balance the benefits plus with the fuel detriment?
You want to take that, Jessica?
Yeah, sure. I can take a shot and you can pipe in, Dave. I think the important thing with fuel reduction is really to focus on those fine fuels that are really going to drive fire behavior. You want to make sure you decrease ladder fuels so that the fire is less likely to get up into the canopy. So it's not as much, you know, those large down logs that are increasing fire risk in many forests. So I think you could still maintain those, try to strike a balance to get those large down logs, you know, keep them there to increase soil moisture and provide wildlife habitat. But we really try to focus on the finer fuels that drive fire behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't pull those big logs out of the woods. Those have, you know, high value for habitat for all kinds of different critters. In Washington forest practice, I believe it's required after timber harvest that you leave around 10 tons per acre of woody material across the landscape. Glenn, you may know that number for Oregon, I'm not sure, but there certainly is a great awareness of the importance of that material on the ground. But as Jessica said, focus on that small diameter stuff, 3 inches diameter or less.
Yeah, I guess that relates to some more on the general topic. You talk about one of the methods of adapting to climate change would be increasing fuels reduction. And particularly if we do more thinning, it tends to generate more slash. And so there's a trade-off. You have to increase your management of that debris so that you don't sort of exacerbate one problem while you're thinning out the canopy for, you know, reducing competition and moisture stress, but you might be increasing fuels. And then you also raise the question about, well, on west side, where catastrophic infrequent fire is kind of what we can expect, and how much real effect does fuels reduction have. But I think there is a balance there, and you emphasize, you know, well, where you do it and how you do it, you know, closer to the high value resources or the interface. You know, I guess it's a pretty deep subject, but that's one that's really on our minds now when we're trying to look at fire being more common with increasing ignitions and fire season, you know, increasing fire weather, as you showed in the climate projections. You know, what are some of the strategies that we might be emerging for fuels reduction in west side forests?
Well, we always, you know, point people towards the FireWise USA website, which is kind of the go-to location for advice on how to manage this for individual properties. And it's focused mostly on landowners who may live in a wooded situation that could potentially be subject to fire. And they talk about a spatial strategy in terms of removal of vegetation and fuels, moving from your home outward to 100-some feet from the house. And there's also, of course, a big focus on having homes and structures that are fire resistant or fireproof, at least to some extent, and all the other kinds of things you can do to help make your home more resistant to fire. So there are lots of things we can do, and I think the challenge, Glenn and others, is that we need to do this not just as individuals, but as communities, to have whole communities of people who are working together to develop these consistent strategies to reduce potential effects of fire if and when it does occur. And there's no 100%, you know, guarantee on any of this stuff, but I think anytime people, you know, do these sorts of activities, you get ready for a potential event, you're going to feel better about it. You won't be afraid of it, and then you can move on and deal with it. So I guess that's my response to that. But there's certainly a huge social component to this.
Yeah, and I guess we have a lot of work going on fuels reduction and fire preparedness, which we will deal with in other webinars. But you know, one of the facts is that the less fuel and the less heat and less fire. So to the extent that you can do effective fuels reduction, and particularly making it less continuous, so reducing that continuous field of fuel. And one of the things that comes up with what you're talking about, the fine fuels versus coarse fuels, is that for people that have lots of, 5 to 10 inch size sticks that they want to deal with, make clumps of it, make piles of it, or, even instead of one big log, you have a bunch of little logs clustered together. That acts somewhat like a big log, and it also then concentrates fuel and separates it so it's not continuous. So there's things that, I think we're going to be adapting new techniques on the west side. We can't necessarily get rid of it all and rake the forest up, but we can change the distribution of fuel. We can be intelligent about making, discontinuous and bigger clumps of fuel, which also then provide organic matter and retain moisture. So I'm looking forward to some new, strategies that we develop. There's another question from Dave Bugney here, and let's see. There may be an increase in the growing season length, which you might think could increase productivity in some cases, but will increased temperatures result in periods of decrease or very little growth because they're just so stressed by drought. And our local species many of them aren't that adapted to a warmer, drier growing season, so they can't take advantage of it.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely. We expect, as Dave kind of pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, those areas that have always been water limited are likely to become even more water limited, which is going to decrease their growth. So, there could be periods in the spring when the trees could grow more than they have historically because of warmer temperatures, but overall that's likely to be offset by those increases in water stress in the summer.
Yeah, the topic of heat domes was mentioned there by Dave. I don't think any of us know about what will happen with that, and we don't know if that becomes more common in the future. But we certainly had a good example of the effects of it this past June. I think one of the keys to the kinds of damage that we saw, which was pretty much unprecedented in my experience, was the fact that heat did occur in June, and it didn't occur in August. And it mostly occurred on newer foliage, which hadn't fully matured yet, hadn't created the lignins and the thickening cuticle that helps keep conifer needles and other kinds of leaves resistant to evaporation and is resistant to that extreme drying that was occurring at that point in time. I think if that heat had occurred in August, we wouldn't have seen quite as much effects, but nonetheless, it was a good example of what can happen during an extreme heat event. And most of our native species, I think, will come through this pretty well. If we do that 3 or 4 years in a row, I think we could see some pretty interesting outcomes.
Yeah, that was rather extreme. And I note that Gail put in the chat to remind everyone that this will be recorded, and so people can access this recording, because I might have to go back and watch certain parts of it. And let's see, is there a new question in the chat? Just a certainly a reminder that if you wanted to donate to support the conference, she's giving the website for that. Well, I have another question I could ask. Really interested in the outlook on what can we do, and your summary there, David. And in terms of adopting the recommendations that you're describing, I mean, we're really looking hard for those early adopters or examples. So can you think of places where there are some forest managers, and maybe you, Jessica, in terms of the people that are at these workshops talking about adaptation, strategies and tactics. So where are people starting to do some of this? That's the first part of my question. Do you have some good examples to point us to, and where can we go and learn from others who are maybe early adopters?
I can start. I know that the topic of roads and changing hydrology has really caught on. I know there are several national forests that are looking at their road networks. They're looking at the future projections for changes in snow and flooding, and that's affecting their road management plan and how they think about their road network. They're looking at, where are the places where there are high risks and maybe low usage on the roads, and can we get rid of those roads, think about decommissioning them, and where might there be some high risks where we have a high usage, and those are the places where we might have to do more maintenance. So I know that Mount Baker Snoqualmie is doing some of that. We know the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest has been thinking about climate change in terms of restoration and what they shoot for in terms of forest density. And they've taken the approach of actually looking at one plant association that's drier or lower in elevation and using that more as a guide for their future density and stocking and what they do for their thinning treatments. We have a lot of people thinking about post-fire management, a lot of questions there. I think that work is really just getting underway. There are a lot of people who are putting out some trials in terms of trying new seed zones, planting more, shooting for kind of mid-century in terms of climate, what trees can do well in the current climate, but also potentially do well with the mid-century climate, and using tools like the seed lot selection tool to help them with that. I can put that link in the chat here. So we're already talking to some silviculturists in the Bootleg Fire about how to think about climate change and how that should affect their post-fire restoration work. So, yeah, and Dave has some other examples.
Yeah, I think in terms of forest management, we're just getting started on this topic, in all honesty. And so we don't have lots of examples yet, but we do have lots of people thinking about this. And that's the first step in actually implementing things. And I think when we do have fires, now it forces people to think about what they're going to do after that fire. When they have to do replanting, then they think about more, perhaps in greater detail, about what kind of nursery stock they're going to use. And you know, Glenn, you work a lot with small forest landowners too, of course, and we see them starting to get interested in this. But not a lot of applications yet. I think we'll see a lot more over the next decade. And there's one other thing I want to mention too on the topic of water that Jessica broached, and that is on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. They've been very proactive in terms of restoring beaver populations on the forest. We like to have beavers out there to make their dams and hold that water out there so they retain water up in those systems to counteract the declining snowpack. That's very helpful for fish habitat, stream flows, and so forth. And they've been doing that for quite a while now. So there are some good success stories out there. Not enough, but I hope in the next 10 years we make some good progress and start, moving forward a little bit more aggressively.
All right, thank you. There's an observation here from Peck from the Forest Service, who was one of our earlier presenters. She says that anecdotally, it appears that some restoration that was done in the South Mackenzie area that burned, it shows that it looks like the fire behavior was mitigated by some of the treatments they were doing down there. And I think that points to, areas that were managed, with some fuels reduction or some thinning or other practices and, more and more science that we need to show, how did we succeed in changing fire behavior more at a landscape level. So there's research interest in that, she says, and stay tuned. And in fact, I was invited to a field tour to look at some areas where they had purposely had a mixed hardwood conifer plantation, and in comparison to a pure conifer plantation, and then that burned. Wasn't part of the research plan, but they observed that the fire behavior changed dramatically when it got into the the hardwood mix. So those are examples, more of that managing for diversity and the mixed stands as one of the resilience, a strategy for resilience. There's a question here about supplemental watering. Bruce is asking, if you are going to pamper your seedlings and even go to the extent of watering, which quite a few landowners are doing, where they can, what are the recommendations of how you do that? When do you start? What time of year and how much?
Yeah, that's quite a commitment. Not everybody is going to be prepared to do that, but I'd like to back up on that process just a minute and recommend to folks that they plant tree seedlings in the fall, if they possibly can. Now, the fact is that most of the nurseries, the big nurseries that supply large numbers of seedlings, will tend to do that in the mid to late winter on into the early spring, and that's kind of the traditional time for planting. But boy, it's a huge advantage if you can do that planting in the fall when we have lots of soil moisture for the next few months and get those seedlings established. So that's one thing to do. In terms of watering, I don't have any particular recommendations other than to give them as much water as you can, as often as you can, especially as we do the run-up to July and August.
Yeah, given how difficult it is to water, you want to probably target the most effective, what you think when the dry season really kicks in. And of course, you're trying to guess when those trees are running out of water. A lot of that's going to depend on how much competition they have. So, in some of the areas I saw planted after the burn, first few months of summer, there wasn't a lot of vegetation regrowth. And so to the extent that the seedlings were able to grow roots, it's not as bad as if they were surrounded by grass or competing vegetation. So it's going to be a judgment call as to when they need water, but probably starting in July, I would say. And in most cases, of course, this last summer was both spring and summer were so warm and dry. And then the big heat event, we had terrible losses in a lot of our plantings at lower elevations, especially. So you can't always do anything about those extreme events.
And also, Glenn, we tend to think about planting seedlings in big open areas, but there are lots of situations where you can plant in the understory of existing stands, and particularly in hardwood stands like red alder, which may live to be only 60 years or so. Good planting is to start doing some understory planting of others, particularly conifers, that will be shade tolerant and get you ready for that next stand after the red alders start to die, or if you harvest the site. And that definitely reduces the stress on seedlings to have some shade.
Yep. I see that Dave Bugney points out that they do a lot of fall transplanting. So that's the case where you do your own, lifting of a wild seedling from one place to another, and just plant it right away somewhere else. And that can be quite successful. There has been development of fall planting, procedures where the nurseries purposely make seedlings available, usually done with containerized stock, what we call plug seedlings, where they can actually induce dormancy earlier, because it is good to plant seedlings when they're dormant as opposed to, if they're actively growing. So that might be some nursery technology in planting that we plan for more in the future with fall planting. I see that Barb observes that wind played a big part in the wildfire spread. And also, we had the February ice storms. How is wind being considered in climate change studies?
Yeah, they do look at wind in the global climate models and also smaller scale models, but those projections are not indicating there's going to be increases in wind events. In fact, some even suggest there might be decreases in those wind events. That doesn't mean they're not going to happen like they have historically, but climate change isn't expected to make them worse. But particularly the east wind situation that exacerbated the Labor Day fires, that is an area of active research, whether that situation might occur more or less frequently in the future. But we've had a couple studies on that so far. Some suggest increases, some decreases. So it's really uncertain at this point.
Okay. Well, with that, I don't see any new questions in the chat. So I think I'll just kind of proceed to wrap things up a bit, and point out that our next session in a couple of weeks, September 21st, is going to be myself and also with Port Blakely, Bonnie Glendenning. We're going to talk about the benefits of forests in the Clackamas. And so we'll have a discussion about the various kinds of benefits across all the different values and uses of the forest. And if you're registered for this one, you're registered for that one. But Gail will put the link to register in the chat. And then we're going to send a thank you, an email with these links, and also the link to the recording and more information about getting into if you want to get continuing education units from the Clackamas Community College. So I really want to thank David and Jessica for your presentation today. And this is I'm really going to go back and look at this one again and also be in touch with both of you probably as we continue to try to help people understand and adapt to climate change in our forests. I want to also thank our gold sponsors, the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and Clackamas Water Environment Services, our bronze sponsors, Clackamas River Water Partners and Metro and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, who help us keep this conference free for all participants. Every little bit helps, and if you like what you see, please consider a small donation. So I think with that, just want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And thanks again to Jessica and David. And with that, I'll adjourn the session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.